What's up guys, Greg here with LensProToGo, and if you follow Panasonic, you might have seen that they announced a new camera on Monday at CES, and that's a new version of their GH5, the GH5s. This camera is supposed to be their super low light camera to compete with the A7S series from Sony. Sadly, I don't have one in hand to do a full hands-on review, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about it, some of the specs, what's changed, and see if it's worth it to upgrade if you already have a GH5, or if it's worth the extra $500 if you're looking to get into this system. First, let's start with what hasn't changed. It has the same magnesium alloy body, which is fully weather sealed and is freeze-proof up to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. And it still has the same flip-out screen that we all love. Really, from the outside of this camera, if they didn't add the red accents onto it, you wouldn't be able to tell a difference. Literally, all of the buttons are in the exact same place, it's the same size, everything is the same on the outside of this camera. Internally, it still has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi connectivity features, and it uses the same Venus processing engine to allow you to shoot 4K 60p at 422 10-bit internally at 400 megabits per second to the dual Cfast cards, with no record limits, and has all of the same video tools like scopes and focus assist. To see most of the changes, you have to look a little bit deeper into this camera. Starting with the biggest change, it has an all-new digital live MOS sensor, but it's only about half the resolution at 10.28 compared to 20.3 megapixels on the GH5. Now they did this to allow each pixel on the same micro 4/3 size sensor to be larger, thus allowing for more light gathering ability and better low light performance. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Because this is a lower resolution sensor, the anamorphic video takes a hit, only allowing for 4K instead of the roughly 6K anamorphic video on the GH5. This also applies to the photo burst mode, where you can only do 4K instead of 6K. Let's talk about some frame rates. The GH5s has increased the VFR, or variable frame rate, from 180 frames per second in Full HD to 240 frames per second in Full HD. Now, the only caveat is that after 204 frames per second, you start to crop in on the sensor. Now, I don't know how much that is, but it's definitely something I'm going to look into once we get our hands on the camera. Also, the frame rate options for DCI 4K, which is 4096 by 2160, has increased from 24 frames a second up to 60 frames a second, and anywhere in between, so you can do 24, 30, 50, or 60. But nothing has changed with the codec. You're still shooting 420 8-bit, so I don't know how many people are going to switch over to shoot this DCI 4K if you can get 422 10-bit in the normal UHD 4K. This next thing's pretty interesting, and I can't wait to test it out and see how well it actually works, but Panasonic said they've increased their read speed of their sensor by 1.3 times. That means that rolling shutter effect is going to be decreased by about 25% compared to the GH5 currently. That could be a really good thing for people who are shooting more cinematic type stuff and don't want that jello effect when they're panning around. This new sensor also adds a slightly wider aspect ratio of 17:9 to the lineup of 16:9, 4:3, 3:2, and 1:1. What this is going to do is give you a little bit wider aspect ratio coming straight out of camera, and it might be a little more cinematic instead of having to add in crop bars or change the ratio in post. Let's get back to talking about the low light. This is Panasonic's biggest selling and marketing point about this camera. So besides changing the sensor and making the pixels physically bigger to allow for more light gathering, they've also added in something that they're taking from their higher end line of cameras like the EVA1 and the VariCam, and that's their dual native ISO. This allows the sensor to keep the noise levels at a minimum at two separate ISOs, one at 400 and one at 2500. If you want to understand a little better how this dual native ISO technology works, I'll throw a link to a video I did explaining it, and I'll also put that in the description below. This camera has increased the base ISO from 25,600 all the way up to 51,200. I've seen some test videos of pre-production cameras pushing this high ISO, and it actually looks really good. I can't wait to get one in my hands and do some of my own tests and share my findings with you. Now, having better low light doesn't just help with having brighter exposures, it can also help with the autofocus system. Panasonic hasn't done anything to improve the autofocus in this camera, but because of the better low light performance, it also has better autofocus in low light, allowing it to be effective into -5 EV, where it was only -4 on the GH5, so a whole stop of difference. One last thing before I get into the biggest downside of this camera is that the viewfinder has been upgraded with a refresh rate of 120 frames per second. This is going to help you follow the action a little bit better, give you a cleaner image, and also allow you to pull focus through the viewfinder. Onto the biggest downside of this camera, and what I think is going to turn a lot of people off from getting it or upgrading if they already have a GH5, and that's that there's no IBIS or in-body stabilization, which means you can't utilize the dual image stabilization that some of these Panasonic lenses have. Panasonic stabilization is probably one of the best, if not the best, built-in stabilization systems in a camera today. And I know a lot of people who like to shoot handheld and just run and gun really quick, get those shots, are not going to be able to do that now because they're going to need a gimbal or some other sort of stabilization, and that's going to make their shooting less efficient. So it has a lower megapixel count, it's got a lower resolution anamorphic video, and it has no built-in in-body stabilization. What it comes back with is better ISO performance and their dual native ISO technology. It has higher variable frame rates up to 240 frames a second, the downside being the crop after 204. It has Vlog pre-installed, which will cost you $100 if you want to have that added to your GH5. There is less rolling shutter, which could actually be a pretty big difference. And there's DCI 4K up to 60p instead of just 24. But besides the low light, it lacks a lot of the features that would really put it over the edge and make it worth that $500 extra if you're deciding between a GH5 and a GH5s. And the downside of not having in-body image stabilization, it's going to be a tricky sell for Panasonic to get this camera out there into the market. Let me know what you think about this camera in the comments below, and if you have a GH5, are you going to upgrade or are you going to stick with what you have? That's going to be all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and got something out of it. If you did, hit that thumbs up button right down below. Also subscribe for new videos every week, and I'll see you in the next one.